"He did not move," the guard whispered, and his voice carried the kind of trembling that men only allow themselves in the moments before everything they believe in begins to crack. "My king." The beast did not obey. It broke the chains. All of them. And then it walked. The throne room fell silent. Not the polite silence of ceremony or the respectful silence of a court in attendance. This was the silence of 200 wolves, holding their breath at the same time, a collective suspension of disbelief so complete that even the candles seemed afraid to flicker. King Kalen did not move from his throne. He sat the way he always sat, with the particular stillness of a man who had trained himself never to show the first reaction, never the instinctive one, because the first reaction was always the honest one, and an honest king was a vulnerable king. His silver eyes moved slowly across the marble hall, past the rows of nobles in their ceremonial finery, past the pillars draped in the deep blue and gold of House Varric, past the open corridor that led toward the lower chambers where the beast was kept. He did not look at Lady Vienne, who stood to his left in a gown the color of winter roses, her expression arranged into something that was almost concern, but was really the careful calculation of a woman measuring exactly how much alarm to display. He did not look at his generals. He did not look at his council. He looked at the corridor, and then he looked at her. Sarah Voss stood at the edge of the crowd near the eastern wall, exactly where she always stood, exactly where people like her were supposed to stand when they were permitted inside a space like this one at all. She was wearing her work clothes because no one had told her to change, because no one had thought to tell her, because she was the kind of person that other people remembered to exclude only after the fact. Her hair was pulled back without artistry. Her hands were calloused from the stables. She had a small cut on her left hand from the iron latch of the feeding corridor door, a cut she had not tended to yet because there had not been time, and a thin line of dried blood crossed her palm like an accidental prophecy. She was not beautiful in the way that the women of the court were beautiful, with their careful arrangements and their practiced expressions and their gowns that had been designed to make every man in a room think about them. She was something else entirely, something that had no official name in the court vocabulary, something that the court did not have a category for because it had never needed one. She was simply present. She was simply real. And the beast had walked past 200 people to stand in front of her. The creature stood 3 feet away from her now, and Sarah was not breathing. She understood, in some cold and distant part of her mind, that she should be terrified. The beast of House Varric was not a wolf in any ordinary sense. It was the ancestral guardian, the oldest living creature bound to the royal bloodline, kept in the deep chambers beneath the palace, not as a pet or a prisoner, but as a relic, a living proof of the ancient compact between the first Alpha King and the primordial spirits of the land. It was the size of a draft horse. Its fur was the color of charcoal and moonlight mixed together. Its eyes were the color of old amber, deep and burning, and full of something that was too complicated to be called an animal. Expression. It had broken chains that had held for over 100 years. It had walked through a crowd of 200 frightened wolves without touching a single one of them. And now it was standing in front of Sarah Voss, the girl from the stables, the Omega with no powers, the woman that nobody thought about twice, and it had lowered its enormous head until its forehead was almost touching the ground, and every person in the room was watching, and none of them had any words for what they were. Seeing. Sarah raised her hand. She did not decide to raise it. Her body moved before the decision formed, the way it always did in the stables when she was working with a frightened animal, purely on instinct, purely from the long-practiced knowledge that a creature in distress needed to feel a presence before it could accept it. Her bloodied palm moved forward through the air, and she pressed it gently to the beast's enormous head, right between the burning amber eyes, and the creature made a sound that no one in the room had ever heard it make before. It was not a growl. It was not a warning. It was something that resonated in the chest and behind the eyes, and in the back of the throat. Something that vibrated through the stone floor and up through the soles of every foot in the room. Something that the oldest wolves present would later struggle to describe, and would ultimately compare to the sound of a ward being lifted, to the feeling of a door unlocking, to the relief of a held. Breath finally released after a very, very long time. Then King Kalen stood up from his throne, and the entire room remembered to breathe again. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. Sarah heard the movement before she processed its meaning. She heard the shift of weight, the soft sound of boots on marble, the collective small sounds of a court adjusting itself in response to its king rising. She did not remove her hand from the beast's head. She was not sure she could. There was something happening beneath her palm that she had no language for. A warmth that was not temperature, a connection that was not physical, a recognition that moved through her like a current through water and settled somewhere deep in her chest where she had always kept her most private and most painful things. The beast was looking at her. Not through her, the way animals sometimes looked when they were registering. Proximity, without true seeing. At her. With the specific and focused attention of something ancient enough to have developed the patience for certainty. Remove your hand. The voice was very quiet. It was the kind of quiet that carried farther than a shout, that filled every corner of a room without effort, that communicated authority, not through volume, but through the simple and absolute expectation of being obeyed. Sarah looked up. King Kalen was standing at the base of the throne steps, perhaps 15 feet away, and he was looking at her with the same focused attention that the beast was using, except that his was different. His was complicated in a way that the beast's was not. His silver eyes had a quality that she had never seen in them before. Not that she had made a practice of looking at him directly. Not that a stable hand had any business studying the king's eyes. But she had seen him at a distance many times. Had seen the careful neutrality that he wore as naturally as his crown, had seen the controlled authority that never flickered. What she saw now was not that. What she saw now was something she could not name. Something that moved behind the silver like weather behind glass. Something controlled so tightly that the control itself was a kind of expression. She removed her hand. The beast made a sound of protest. Low, resonant, immediate. The kind of sound that said clearly and without ambiguity that it did not agree with this decision. The king's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah took one step back and then stopped, because her legs were not entirely reliable at this particular moment, and she had a strong instinct that falling down in front of the king of the Western Pax was not going to improve her situation. "Your name," he said. Not a question. An instruction. "Sarah Voss," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected, which was perhaps the only good thing that had happened in the last 4 minutes. "Voss," he repeated, and something moved across his face. Not recognition exactly, something more careful than recognition. "You work in the stables." It was also not a question. "Yes, my king." He looked at her for a long moment. She held herself still under the weight of that look, and told herself that the warmth in her palm was simply an injury responding to the cold air of the throne room and had nothing to do with anything else at all. "You will be escorted to the East Wing," he said. "You will stay there until I send for you. You will speak to no one about what happened here." He looked at his guards then, the kind of look that moved people without the need for additional words, and 2 of them stepped forward immediately. He did not look at Sarah again. He looked at the beast, which was still standing where it had stood, still watching Sarah with those burning amber eyes, and he said something to it in a language she did not recognize, something old and low and precise, and the beast moved. Slowly, with the particular dignity of something that was choosing to comply rather than being compelled to. It padded back toward the corridor. It did not look away from Sarah until it physically could not any longer. The room exhaled. Lady Vienne made a small sound, perfectly timed and perfectly calibrated, something between a laugh and a sigh that managed to communicate both amusement and dismissal without committing to either. "What an extraordinary stable girl," she said, to no one in particular, to everyone in particular, and several people around her found the appropriate response in their expressions immediately. Sarah heard it. Of course she heard it. She had excellent hearing, one of the few physical gifts her Omega status had not taken from her, and she heard every word that Lady Vienne said, and every small sound of agreement that rippled outward from it like a stone dropped in water. She said nothing. She let the guards take her to the East Wing. She kept her face exactly as it had been. She had been keeping her face exactly as it needed to be for 23 years, and she was not going to stop now, simply because the most terrifying creature in the known world had just bowed at her feet in front of an audience of 200 people, and a king whose eyes she could still feel on the back of her neck as she walked away. The East Wing was not the servants' quarters. Sarah had been in the servants' quarters. She had lived in them for 3 years, in a small room she shared with 2 other stable hands, a room that smelled of hay and leather, and the particular cold that settled into stone walls during the night season. The East Wing was a different matter entirely. The corridor she was taken to had carpets thick enough to muffle every footstep. The walls held paintings that were clearly not decorative but meaningful, old works depicting scenes she recognized from pack history, from the founding wars, from the age of the First Compact. The room she was taken to had a fireplace already burning, a window that looked out over the palace gardens, a bed that was wider than her entire previous room, and a bath chamber attached. There was fresh clothing laid out on the bed, simple but well made, the kind of clothing that did not belong to anyone in particular, but was clearly intended for a person of some standing. The guards left without speaking to her. The door was not locked. She checked. She tested the handle carefully, listening for any mechanism, any catch, and there was nothing. She was not a prisoner. She was something else, something the palace did not have a ready category for, much like herself, she supposed. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. The cut on her left palm had stopped bleeding at some point during everything that had happened. She pressed her right thumb against it and felt nothing unusual. Just a cut, just skin, and a little dried blood. Just the ordinary consequence of working with iron. Latches in the early morning. She told herself this very firmly and almost believed it. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed, still telling herself various firm things about the nature of reality, when the door opened without a knock, and Lady Vienne walked in, as though the room already belonged to her, as though she had simply been elsewhere for a moment, and was now returning to her rightful space. She was even more striking up close than she was from across a throne room. She was tall, with the particular grace of a woman who had been trained in it from childhood, dark hair arranged in an elaborate construction that suggested effortlessness, while clearly requiring the opposite. A face that combined sharpness and softness, in a ratio that was clearly calculated to be universally appealing. Her gown moved around her like something alive. She looked at Sarah with an expression that was generous and concerned, and absolutely without warmth. "I thought I should come and see how you were settling in," Lady Vienne said, and her voice was the kind of voice that landed softly and left marks. "It must be very disorienting. All of this. For someone from the stables." She paused just long enough to let the last 4 words complete their work. "I am fine," Sarah said. "Thank you." Lady Vienne tilted her head slightly. She looked at Sarah the way someone looks at an object they are deciding whether to bother worrying about. "The king is very private about the beast," she said then. "Whatever happened today, whatever you think it means, I would encourage you to be careful about what stories you tell yourself. Ancient creatures are unpredictable. They respond to scent, to fear, to any number of stimuli that have nothing to do with destiny or significance or anything so romantic as that." She smiled. It was a beautiful smile. It did not reach her eyes. I only mention it because I would hate for you to be hurt. The court can be unkind to people who misunderstand their own importance. She waited just a beat to let that settle, and then she turned and walked out of the room with the same unhurried authority with which she had entered it. And Sarah sat very still on the edge of the bed and breathed slowly and deliberately and thought about every single thing that had just been communicated to her in words that sounded almost like concern. She understood threats. She had grown up in them. She had grown up in a pack that had tolerated her because she was useful and had made her understand her limits, because that was simply the order of things, because an Omega without powers was a useful thing to have around, but was not a thing to be confused with a person of consequence. She understood the vocabulary of being put in your place. She spoke it fluently. What Lady Vienne had just done was simply a more sophisticated version of something Sarah had been hearing all her life, delivered with more craft and in a nicer room. But the core message was identical. You do not belong here. Do not forget that. Do not let whatever happened today make you foolish enough to think otherwise. Sarah stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the palace gardens, which were gray and silver in the late afternoon light, perfectly arranged, perfectly controlled. Everything exactly where someone had decided it should be. She put her left hand against the cold glass and looked at the thin line of the cut on her palm. The warmth was back. Not from the glass, obviously. The glass was cold. From somewhere else. From somewhere inside her hand, inside her blood. Somewhere she had no map for, and no words for, and no explanation for. She pressed her palm harder against the glass. The warmth did not stop. 3 days passed. Sarah did not leave the East Wing except to walk briefly in the garden corridor in the early mornings when no one was about. She had always been a person who needed the sky above her to think clearly, a habit developed in the stables where the work was inside. But the air came through the high windows at odd angles and carried the smell of the season. And she found that the garden corridor at dawn had something of that same quality, the particular cold clarity of very early air before the palace machinery woke up and began its daily performance of purpose. She walked slowly, and she thought, which was the activity that passed most naturally for her in the absence of work to do. She thought about what she knew and what she did not know, what the distance between those two things was shaped like. She thought about the warmth in her palm, which she had tested, carefully and methodically, the way she would test any unknown element in a new situation. It responded to proximity to Aldrich. She had established that. It responded to the old book Kaelin had not yet given her, but would, she found herself thinking, though she could not have said why she was so certain of it. It responded, faintly but unmistakably, when she was near Kaelin himself, a fact she examined with the same deliberate care she was giving everything else, and refused to draw conclusions from until she had more information. She was a practical person. She had always been a practical person. Practicality was one of the things that the stables had given her, along with calluses and an early rising habit, and a precise understanding of how much a living thing could endure before it simply stopped. She applied practicality to this situation the way she applied it. To everything, by looking at what was actually there rather than what she wished were there. By taking careful inventory before deciding how to proceed. Meals were brought to her by a silent servant who would not meet her eyes. She had no visitors except one, a quiet young man named Fen, who identified himself as the king's personal attendant, and who brought her, on the second day, a small collection of books, with a note that said only, "In case you need something to do while you wait," with no signature and no seal, and who looked at her with the particular careful blankness of someone who had been instructed not to give anything away. She read the books. She thought about the warmth in her palm, which had not entirely faded. She thought about the beast's amber eyes. She thought about the king's silver ones. And then she made herself stop thinking about those, and went back to the amber ones, which were safer. On the morning of the 4th day, Fen came again, and told her that the king would see her. Kaylin's private study was nothing like the throne room. The throne room was architecture as declaration, all scale and ceremony, and the deliberate manufacture of smallness in anyone who entered it. The study was something a person actually lived in. Books everywhere, not decoratively, but genuinely used, with marks and notes and the soft damage of regular handling. Maps on the walls, some of them very old, some annotated in multiple hands over what looked like decades. A desk that was covered in work, actual work, documents and correspondence, and the evidence of a mind that never entirely stopped. He was standing at the window when she entered, looking out at a different section of the gardens than the one she could see from her room, and he did not turn immediately. She stood in the center of the room and waited, and noticed that she was not as afraid as she had expected to be. She was not sure if that was a good sign or a troubling one. "Sit down," he said still, not turning. She sat. He turned then, and looked at her with those complicated silver eyes, and she looked back, because she was past the point of pretending she was not paying attention. He was younger than she had always thought from a distance. Not young exactly, but younger than the weight of him suggested. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that came from too little sleep and too much responsibility, rather than from age. He was looking at her the way she sometimes looked at a problem she could not immediately solve, with the particular focused attention of someone who needed to understand something precisely and was not yet there. "Tell me what you felt," he said. No preamble, no context. Just the question, direct as a hand reaching through water. "When?" she said, because she needed to be sure they were talking about the same moment. "When Aldrich came to you," he said. Aldrich. She had not known the beast had a name. Something shifted in her chest slightly at that. Knowledge. The way things sometimes shifted when a fact revealed that something she had thought of as a symbol was actually a person. "Warmth," she said. "In my hand, in my palm." And then something else, something I do not have a word for. Like recognition, like something that had been waiting. He was very still. "You have felt it before," he said. Not a question. She paused. "Sometimes," she admitted. "In the stables, with animals that were frightened. It helps them settle. I thought it was just instinct." "It is not just instinct," he said. He moved away from the window and sat in the chair across from her, close enough that she could see the texture of his expression clearly, close enough that she became aware of him as a physical presence in a way that was inconvenient, and which she immediately catalogued and filed away for later, much later, when she was alone and could be confused about it in private. "My family has records," he said. "Very old ones, going back to the founding of the compact. There is a gift described in those records that appears rarely, sometimes once in a generation, sometimes less. A capacity for the old language. Not the speaking of it, but the feeling of it. An attunement to the ancestral bond." He paused. His eyes were steady on hers. "Aldrich has not responded to anyone outside the royal bloodline in over 300 years. He was bound to respond only to the line of Varak. That binding was put in place after a period of particular vulnerability, after an event that cost the pack very much." He stopped. She waited. The fire in the study made small sounds. "What happened 4 days ago should not have been possible," he said. "And yet it was. And so I need to understand what you are, Sarah Voss, because whatever you are, it changes things. For the pack, for the compact, and for me. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." The word hung in the air between them. For me. If he had meant to say that last part, or if he had said it deliberately, or if there was a version of the king that sometimes said things before the careful part of him could organize them into something more appropriate. She looked at his face and could not determine which it was. He was already pulling back into the controlled silver neutrality that she was more familiar with from a distance, and she watched it happen the way you watch a door closing before you can decide whether to go. Through it. "I do not know what I am," she said honestly. "I have never had powers. I have never manifested. I am an omega without a wolf form. That is the beginning and the end of what I know about myself." Something moved in his face. She thought it might be the brief, involuntary expression of something complicated, quickly suppressed. "You have never shifted," he said. "No. How old are you?" 23. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, something he was examining while he said them. "The gift described in the records. It appears in those who have not yet fully awakened. It is a precursor, a sign of something larger that has not yet found its form." She felt the warmth move through her hand again, sudden and unmistakable. She pressed her palm against her knee under the table and breathed. "I need you to stay," he said. "Not as a guest, as someone the palace is responsible for. There are people who will have seen what happened. There are people who will draw conclusions that could put you in danger if you are not here, where I can ensure your safety. And if I do not want to stay," she said. She said it not because she intended to leave, but because she needed to know if she had the choice. His jaw was very slightly set. "Then I would explain to you, very carefully, the nature of the danger, and I would ask you again," he said. "And if I still refused, then I would not stop you," he said. "But I would be very concerned." It was, she thought, a remarkably precise answer. It was the answer of someone who was used to having absolute authority and was choosing, consciously and with some effort, not to use it. She was not sure what to do with that. She filed it away with the other inconvenient things. "I will stay," she said. The following 2 weeks were strange in ways that Sarah did not entirely have vocabulary for. She was given access to the palace library, which was vast, and to the outer grounds with a single guard escort, and to a small set of rooms that were hers and that she was beginning, cautiously, to think of as hers. Fen continued to serve as her primary point of contact, and she liked him, genuinely, in the uncomplicated way that she liked honest people who did not expect her to perform a version of herself that was not accurate. She was not introduced to the court. She was not presented or explained or given any official context. She was simply present in a palace that was not quite sure what category she belonged to, eating her meals in her rooms or in a small private dining room near the library. Not quite a servant anymore, but not anything else anyone had a name for. It suited her, in a way. She had always lived in the space between categories. She was accustomed to the particular freedom of being illegible to the systems that organized other people's lives. She visited Aldrich every second day. This had been Kaylin's arrangement, offered without explanation, simply a schedule of access given to her as though it were administrative. She understood that it was something more than administrative. She did not say so. She went to the deep chambers in the company of a guard and a palace scholar named Orla, who watched everything Sarah did in Aldrich's presence with an expression of barely contained scholarly excitement, and took notes in a small leather journal with total concentration. Aldrich was always waiting. She was not sure how he knew when to expect her. Through the stone walls and the locked corridors, but he always moved to the front of his space when she arrived, and the amber eyes were always on her before she was fully through the door. She had stopped being frightened of him after the second visit. She was not sure she had ever been truly frightened of him, not in the way fear was supposed to work. What she felt in his presence was something else, something that felt more like the particular ease of being in company that required nothing. Of you, that simply received you as you were without adjustment or performance. It was the best feeling she had found in the palace. It was, if she was being entirely honest with herself, becoming the second best feeling she had found in the palace. The first best feeling was when Kaylin appeared in the library. He did not do it often, He appeared to have extremely limited time for anything that was not work, and his work was apparently continuous and heavy, the kind of work that did not stop. For evenings or rest days or the ordinary human rhythms that organized less important lives. But 3 times in the 2 weeks, she had looked up from a book and found him there, in the library, ostensibly attending to some piece of his own reading or research, never sitting close to her, never seeking her out with any directness, but present in the same space. The first time, they had not spoken. The second time, he had asked her what she was reading, and she had told him, and he had said something brief and surprising about the historical accuracy of the source, and they had talked for 11 minutes about pack history before he was interrupted by Fen arriving with an urgent message, and he had left without looking back. The third time, he had sat down across from her without preamble and said, "Orla tells me you have been asking about the old language." "I have been curious about it," she said. "It is not commonly taught," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been trying to find texts." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across the table and placed a book there, a small one, very old, with a cover that was worn smooth with handling. "That is the closest thing to a primer that exists," he said. He withdrew his hand. She looked at the book, and then at the space where his hand had been, and then at her own hands, and thought about the warmth in her palm, and made a decision not to examine any of this too carefully right now. "Thank you," she said. "How do you—" "No, I will not use it to do something problematic," she said, and her tone was lighter than she had intended, lighter than she usually allowed herself to be with authority. He looked at her with something that was possibly surprise, and then, unexpectedly, something that was possibly the very beginning of something that could, in time, be considered a smile. "I suppose I am trusting your instincts," he said. "And mine," he said, and looked at his book, and did not say anything else. Lady Vienne visited her again on the 14th day. This time with 2 of her particular friends, women whose names Sarah was given and immediately forgot, women who existed in the specific social register that Lady Vienne operated in, women whose purpose in this visit was clearly aesthetic rather than substantive, providing a kind of elegant chorus that framed Vienne's words as the obvious consensus of reasonable people. They sat in Sarah's small sitting room, and Vienne poured tea that she had brought with her, a gesture that managed to communicate both generosity and ownership simultaneously. "You must be getting so used to all of this," Vienne said warmly. "The library, the access to Aldrich, it is so unusual. The king is very attentive to curiosities." The word curiosities landed exactly where it was meant to. Sarah drank her tea and said nothing. "He is under a great deal of pressure, of course," Vienne continued. "The summit next month, the alliance negotiations, there are expectations about who will stand beside him when the formal announcements are made." She let this settle. She let it be clear and specific and plausibly innocuous all at once. The way she did everything. Ancient creatures choosing unusual companions creates political complications. I am sure you understand that. Aldrich's behavior will have reached the other pack lords by now. There will be interpretations. There will be demands for explanation. She looked at Sarah with those warm and bottomless eyes. "I only think it is worth considering what role you can reasonably expect to play in this, and planning accordingly, so that you are not caught off guard by how things resolve." She smiled. "I would hate for you to have built expectations that the situation cannot support." After they left, Sarah sat in the quiet of the room and looked at the small book Kaelin had given her, sitting on the table where she had left it, and she thought about Lady Vienne's very particular brand of helpfulness, and she thought about the warmth in her palm, and she thought about the way Kaelin had said for me without quite finishing the thought, and she thought about what she had always known about herself, which was that she did not have the kind of life where things simply worked out, and she held both of those truths at the same time and let them exist together without resolving them. She was good at holding contradictions. She had been practicing since she was a child. She opened the small book. The old language did not use any alphabet she recognized. It moved in ways that defied the usual organization of written things, curves and angles and spaces that seemed to carry meaning in their relationship to each other rather than in any individual mark. She should not have been able to read it. She sat with it for a long time, touching the marks lightly with her fingertip, and the warmth in her hand moved with her fingertip. And after a while she began to understand that she was not reading it exactly, but feeling it, the way you feel the shape of a familiar space in the dark. Not from vision, but from some older kind of knowing. She spent the rest of the evening with the book and told no one what she had found in it. The summit was announced 10 days later, and with it, the formal introduction of the court's expectations for queen selection. Sarah learned about this from Fen, who told her with the careful tone of someone delivering information that they were uncertain how to frame. The Western Pack's traditions around queen selection were old and specific. The Alpha King did not simply choose. There was a ceremony, the claiming night, held at the summit's apex, in which the king presented his chosen candidate before the assembled pack lords of all 5 territories and performed the formal bonding ritual that could not be undone. It was political and sacred simultaneously. It was the most watched event in the Western territories every generation, and everyone, including apparently everyone in the palace and the surrounding lands, and probably several neighboring kingdoms, believed that Lady Vienne of House Mira was going to be named the king's choice. She had been positioned for this since before Kaelin took the throne. Her family had sacrificed considerable political capital in support of the Varric succession during a difficult period. She was appropriate in every measurable way. She was also, Fen said carefully, extremely aware of the situation as it currently stands, meaning you. Though he did not say it quite that directly, and Sarah translated from the diplomatic version. And the king, Sarah said carefully. What does the king say about it? Fen looked at the wall just past her shoulder. The king says that tradition will be honored, he said, which was not the same as answering the question. Sarah nodded and thanked him and went to the deep chambers to visit Aldrich, and when she sat with her back against the ancient stone and the beast's enormous head in her lap, and the amber eyes looking up at her with that absolute, uncomplicated certainty of belonging, she allowed herself, very briefly, to feel the thing she had been not feeling for 2 weeks. The disappointment. The particular kind of it that comes from having briefly, foolishly, begun to hope. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Aldrich made a low sound. She looked down at him. He was watching her with those amber eyes that had seen 300 years of this world, and had apparently decided, on the basis of some calculation she did not have access to, that she was the correct person to lower his ancient and formidable head for. She put her hand on his fur, and the warmth moved through her, and she thought about what she had felt in the book, the old language moving under her fingers, the sense of something enormous and patient waiting to be understood. She thought about what Orla the scholar had told her 3 days ago, quietly, almost accidentally, as though the words had escaped from where she was keeping them. The records say that the mate bond does not ask permission, Orla had said, looking at her notes rather than at Sarah. It does not respect hierarchy. It has, historically, made things very complicated for very important people who wanted something simple. And then she had turned a page and returned to her careful writing and not said anything else. Sarah had held that observation for 3 days without examining it. She was examining it now. What do you know that I do not? She said to Aldrich. He blinked slowly. Ancient amber light. 3 centuries of watching the bloodline. 3 centuries of the particular wisdom that comes from being bound to something larger than individual preference. He pushed his head more firmly into her hand. She took a breath. She thought about what the warmth in her palm felt like when she was near Kaelin, when he came to the library, when he placed a book on the table in front of her and withdrew his hand, when his voice was low and direct, and said things like, "Trusting your instincts and mine." She thought about the way he looked at her when he thought she was not looking, which was frequently, and which she had definitely noticed, and which she had been determinedly not thinking about. She thought about what it would mean if the mate bond did not ask permission. She thought about what it would mean for a king who had obligations and for a woman who had nothing, which was the part she kept coming back to, because without anything, you were in a different kind of danger, the kind where you had nothing to lose and also nothing to stand on. Aldrich made the sound again. The door won, the lifting sound. She looked at him and he looked back, and she said very quietly, "I think I need to know what I am before I can know what this is." He regarded her patiently. "I think that is actually your position on the matter," she said. "That I should just know what I am. That it should be enough that you know." He breathed slowly. She breathed with him. The warmth in her hand was very present tonight. She stayed in the deep chambers until the night guards changed, and Fen came to tell her gently that it was late, and she should eat something. The palace changed in the week before the summit. It filled up in the way that palaces fill up when they are about to be needed for their essential function, which is the performance of power, the demonstration of hierarchy, the reassurance of all involved parties that the order of things was still the order of things. Pack lords from the eastern, northern, southern, and coastal territories arrived with their retinues, and the palace staff doubled and then doubled again, and the formal spaces that had been quiet during Sarah's weeks there became loud and purposeful and full of the dense, complicated social traffic of people who needed things from each other. Sarah became, in this context, even more invisible than she had been before, because invisibility scales up. She moved through the corridors of the East Wing and the library and the path to the deep chambers, and no one paid her particular attention because there were far more important things to pay attention to everywhere you looked, and this suited her very well. She watched. She always watched. She had always been better at watching than at being watched, better at understanding the shape of a situation from observation than from participation. What she observed was this. The arrival of the pack lords changed something in the palace's atmosphere, something in the way authority was arranged and displayed, something in the way people positioned themselves relative to each other. She observed that Lady Vienne moved through the newly crowded palace, with the ease of someone whose position was already settled, whose future was already agreed upon, who only needed to wait for the ceremony that would make it official. She observed Kaelin in the distance, at dinner she was not invited to, in corridors she passed through at the edges of scheduled events, and he was, as he always was in public, controlled and silver and impenetrable, except that once, in a corridor near the library, he had seen her and had stopped, and there had been a moment, very brief, perhaps 2 seconds, in which his expression had not been any of the things it was supposed to be. And then it was. And he had nodded, which was apparently all the context the situation was going to provide, and walked on. 2 days before the claiming night, Orla came to her room. Not the scholar's usual hour, not the usual context. She was carrying the leather journal, and she was not hiding her urgency behind academic composure the way she usually did. She sat down without being invited, and opened the journal to a marked page. "I found the original text," she said. "Not the record, the original compact document. It was in a secondary archive that I had to request special access to, and the librarian will probably complain about me to someone, eventually, but that is not the point." She spread the journal on the table. "The binding," she said. "The one on Aldrich. It was not placed to restrict him to the royal bloodline. That is how it has been interpreted for 300 years. But that is not what it says." Sarah looked at the notes. The old language marked there, in Orla's careful copy, was not entirely unfamiliar to her now. She had spent many evenings with the book Kaelin had given her. She could feel the shape of it, "What does it say?" she said. "It says that Aldrich will recognize the one who carries the first queen's blood," Orla said. Her voice was very level. "Not the king's bloodline, the first queen's." She paused. The founding records list 2 bloodlines in the original compact. The Varek line, which became the ruling line, and a secondary line, the one the first queen came from, which was called the Voss line, which was thought to have died out during the Eastern conflicts approximately 2 centuries ago. The room was very quiet. "Voss," Sarah said. She heard her own name in her mouth as though it were a word in the old language, as though it had a shape she had not previously noticed. "The warmth in your hand," Orla said. "The old language, the attunement to Aldrich. These are not the gifts of the Varek blood, which manifests differently. These are the gifts of the first queen's line." She closed the journal. She looked at Sarah with the expression of someone who has spent a long time moving toward an understanding, and has finally arrived at it, and is not sure whether to be happy or frightened. "You are not an Omega without powers," she said quietly. "You are the last of the first queen's bloodline, and you have been living in a stable for 3 years because no one knew to look for you there." Sarah put her hand flat on the table. The warmth ran all the way up her arm. She breathed. She thought about 23 years of being too small for every space she was placed in. She thought about her hands on frightened animals, about the particular ease she had always found in those moments, the sense of something moving through her that she had always attributed to patience or practice or simply the ordinary human gift of being gentle. She thought about the stables and the cold and the small room she had shared and the particular invisibility of people who are permitted to exist, but not to matter. She thought about Aldrich walking through 200 people as though they were simply weather. She thought about what the warmth in her hand had felt like in the moments before the king's voice said, "Remove your hand," before the court's gaze was on her, before Lady Vienne's first carefully measured dismissal. She thought about what she had felt in those moments. She let herself feel it now, uncontested, without the usual arrangement of it into something more modest, something more appropriate for a person of her station. It felt like power. It felt like something that had always been there, that had never needed permission or recognition from anyone, that was not diminished by being unacknowledged, that had simply been waiting, patiently, with the same quality of patience she had recognized in Aldrich's amber eyes, for the moment when she was ready to stop arranging herself into something smaller than she was. "I need to speak with the king," she said. Getting to Kalin was not straightforward. The palace was at full summit capacity, and the king's schedule was, according to Fenn, who she found immediately and somewhat breathlessly, completely saturated from morning until the late night hours. There were meetings she could not interrupt, and dinners she could not enter, and formal receptions where a stable hand turned ambiguous guest certainly had no standing to appear. Fenn looked at her with something between concern and the very particular expression of someone who has been watching a situation develop for weeks and has opinions about how it should resolve. "Tell me what you need," he said quietly. "I need to tell him what I know before tomorrow night," she said. "Because if it changes what he decides at claiming night, he should know it in time to decide differently. If it does not change anything, then it changes nothing, and I will have the information for my own purposes regardless." Fenn looked at her for a long moment. "Your own purposes," he repeated. "Yes," she said. "I am trying to understand what I am. That does not depend on what anyone else decides about it." He nodded slowly. "I will try to find you 10 minutes, he said. "Do not promise me things you cannot arrange," she said. "Manage the expectations." He smiled, genuinely, briefly. "I will do what I can," he said, which was different, and which she trusted. He found her 4 hours later, just as she was beginning to accept that tonight was not going to happen. The king had a window of 15 minutes between 2 events, in the small antechamber near the east corridor, and Fenn would take her there. She followed him through the crowded palace, through corridors that were different at summit capacity, full of the complicated energy of politics in motion, of deals being made in doorways and histories being revised in polite conversation, and the future being arranged by people who believed it was their right to arrange it. She moved through all of it and felt the warmth in her hand and held the knowledge of who she was, the new knowledge, the knowledge that Orla had given her and that had been hers all along without her knowing it. And she carried it carefully, the way you carry something that needs to arrive intact. Kalen was standing in the antechamber with his back to the door when she entered. He turned when he heard her. He was in formal summit attire, the deep blue and silver of the Varek line, and he looked, in this context, every inch the thing. He was the king of the Western Pax, the weight of ancient obligation sitting in him the way it always sat, the controlled silver eyes carrying everything he never said. He looked at her, and something happened in his expression before the control gathered itself. "You have 15 minutes, he said. "Fen tells me it is important." "I know what I am," she said. She did not waste time on context. Orla found the original compact document, not the interpreted records. The original. The binding on. Aldrich was not to the Varek bloodline. It was to the first Queen's bloodline, the Voss line, which was thought extinct. She watched him. She watched the silver eyes absorb this. She watched the careful face go through something very rapid and very controlled that she could not entirely read, but that was unmistakably not neutrality. "The Voss line," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am not without heritage. I am not an anomaly. I am the last of the first Queen's blood, the warmth in my hand, the attunement to the old language, all of it. It is the first Queen's gift. It never died out. It was just lost for 2 centuries. He was very still. "And now you know this," he said. "Yes," she said. "And I wanted you to know it before tomorrow night," she said. "Because I thought it was information you deserved to have. Because whatever you decide, you should decide it knowing the whole shape of things." He took 1 step toward her. Not a large step. A very controlled, very deliberate step. The kind that had been decided rather than simply made. "Sarah," he said. And it was the first time he had used only her first name, without the surname, without the title, or the lack of title. Just the name itself, the specific and particular sound of her. And the warmth in her hand surged all the way through her with a heat that she could not pretend was anything other than what it was. And she stood very still inside it. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to answer me. Honestly. Not with what you think I want to hear. Not with what you think is appropriate. But honestly." "Yes," she said. "What you feel when you are near me," he said. His voice was very careful. "Tell me what that is." She held his gaze. She thought about all the ways she could arrange this, all the ways she could find the diplomatic version, the modest version, the version that made herself legible as a person who was not hoping for anything inappropriate, given the circumstances and her station. She set all of those versions aside. "The same thing Aldrich felt when he walked to me," she said quietly. "Recognition. The feeling of something that was always true becoming known." He closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, the control was still there, but it was doing something different. It was not holding things in anymore. It was holding him together while he let things out. And what came out of the silver eyes was something she had not let herself name before, and was naming now. "Tomorrow night," he said, "at the claiming night. You do not have to explain to me what is expected of you," she said. "The political obligations, the alliances. I understand the weight of those things. I am not explaining what is expected of me," he said. "I am asking you to be there. I am asking you to trust that whatever I do will not be done in ignorance of everything that I know now, And what I know now is different from what I knew this morning." He stepped back. "Statav." 15 minutes were almost gone. "I do not make promises I cannot keep," he said. "But I need you there. Will you be there?" She looked at him. She thought about the warmth in her hand, and the first queen's blood, and Aldrich's amber eyes, and all the years of being too small for every space until this one. "Yes," she said. "I will be there." She was there. Fen had found her something appropriate to wear, simple and clean, and carrying no particular allegiance, no house color, nothing declarative, just the honest truth of her. And she stood at the edge of the great ceremonial hall, as it filled with pack lords and their retinues, and the formal colors of 5 territories, and the dense, complicated gravity of a ceremony that had organized this world for generations. Lady Vienne was positioned in the front, center, where she was supposed to be, dressed in white and silver, radiantly composed, the inevitable shape of the evening made visible. She was beautiful, and she was appropriate, and she had done everything correctly for a very long time in preparation for this specific night. Sarah looked at her and felt something that was not quite pity and not quite respect, but had elements of both, felt it cleanly, without hostility. Because Lady Vienne was a person who had organized her life around a future that was about to be complicated, and that was a genuinely difficult thing, regardless of whether you had any sympathy for her methods. Then Kaelin walked into the hall, and the room did the thing rooms always did when he entered them. They became more organized around him, more gravitationally coherent, as though his presence resolved something ambient and uncertain. He walked to the center of the ceremonial circle, and the pack lords arranged themselves, and the ceremony's ancient language began to be spoken by the officiating elder, words in the old tongue that Sarah could now feel, rather than simply hear, the shape of them pressing against her awareness with the particular warmth. She recognized. She was not expecting what happened next, and she was standing at the edge of the room, and there was no reasonable way to have been prepared for it. Aldrich appeared. He was not supposed to be here. The deep chambers were locked. The guards were at their stations. He was not supposed to be capable of bypassing all of that, except that he was, apparently, the same creature that had broken chains that had held for 100 years, and whatever held him had never been the chains. He came through the outer doors of the hall in the sudden silence that his appearance always created, enormous and certain, charcoal and moonlight, amber eyes burning, and he walked through the assembled crowd with the same unhurried certainty he had demonstrated 3 weeks ago, as though everyone in his path was simply weather. And he walked past Lady Vienne in her white and silver, and he walked past the officiating elder, and he walked to the center of the ceremonial circle, and he stopped beside Kaelin, and he turned and he looked directly across the room at Sarah. Every person in the hall looked at Sarah. Lady Vienne looked at Sarah. The pack lords of 5 territories looked at Sarah. She stood at the edge of the room in her simple dress with her calloused hands, and the thin line of the old scar on her left palm, and the warmth moving through her like something that had never needed permission. And she looked back. "Aldrich has spoken," the officiating elder said after a moment into the profound silence. The old formal words, the ones used only when the ancestral guardian exercised the right of recognition that the compact had given him from the very beginning. The ancient compact acknowledges his choice. Kaelin was looking at her. Across the room, through the crowd, past the pack lords and the politics and the arranged future of a moment ago. His silver eyes found hers and did not look away, and she saw in them the absence of the usual control and the presence of something so specific and so true that it had no polite diplomatic version. He held out his hand toward her, the simple extended hand of a man across a room, asking. Not commanding, not the king's authority reaching for what it was entitled to. Just a hand, just the question of it. She walked across the hall. Every step was visible. Every step was watched. Every step was the distance between who she had been and who she was. and she walked it without arranging her face into anything other than what it was. And when she reached the center of the ceremonial circle and took his hand, the warmth that had lived in her palm since the morning that Aldrich first chose her moved through her entire body with a completeness that felt like waking up, rather than anything that had come before being called sleep. Kaylin's hand around hers was steady and specific, and saying something that was not in any language except the one they were apparently both speaking for the first time together. The Voss line, he said quietly, only for her, his thumb moving across the scar on her palm. I knew, he said. Not the records. I knew before the records. I knew since the first morning. You could have told me, she said, equally quiet. Something in his expression moved. You would not have believed it, he said. You would have thought I was managing you. She considered this for a moment. You are not wrong, she admitted. He looked at her with the silver eyes fully open, and she looked back, and there was nothing managed or controlled or arranged between them in this moment. Just the truth of two people who had found each other by the most improbable route, and were now standing in the center of the most public possible space, holding hands while the entire weight of pack politics redistributed itself around the new fact of them. Lady Vienne had turned away. Sarah noticed this peripherally. Not a retreat, exactly. Something more complicated than that. The movement of a person. Recalculating. A person who had prepared for a particular future and was now beginning the work of preparing for a different one. Sarah held no anger for her. She held nothing for her at all. She had enough of her own things to hold. Aldrich pressed his enormous head against both their joined hands and made the lifting sound. The door sound. The sound of something long held finally being set down, and the officiating elder completed the words of the ceremony in a tone that suggested he was going to need some time afterward to reconcile what had just happened with every ceremony he had ever conducted before, and the pack lords of 5 territories began the complicated social recalibration of people discovering that what they had assumed was settled had been decisively unsettled, and Kaylin tightened his hand around Sarah's and did not look away from her face. I do not know how to be this, she said honestly. Whatever this is going to make me. Neither do I, he said. I have not done this before. You have been king for many years, she said. I have been king, he said. I have not done this. There is a difference. She looked at him and understood what he meant, and felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been arranged into a shape it did not naturally want, something that was very tired of being modest about its own existence. She thought about the stable and the cold and the small room and the 23 years of being appropriately small, and she set them down, not with anger or grief, with the particular respect you have for the things that made you strong enough for the things that came after. Then we will figure it out, she said. His hand was warm. The warmth in her palm was not distinguishable anymore from the warmth of him, and she thought that was probably accurate. That was probably the point. That whatever she was, and whatever he was, had always been oriented toward this specific moment, and the question had never been if, but simply when, and simply who would have the courage to stand still long enough to let it arrive. Behind them, the great hall was filling back up with noise, with the particular complex noise of a world reordering itself, because it was going to have to. Because a stable hand with a scar on her palm, and the first queen's blood, and the most terrifying creature in the western pack standing at her shoulder, had just walked into the center of the ceremonial circle and taken the hand of a king, and the world was going to have to find a place for that. And Sarah thought, with a quiet and steady certainty that was perhaps the most powerful thing she had ever felt, that it would. She thought about the morning 3 weeks ago, when she had pressed a bleeding hand to an ancient creature's head without deciding to, before the decision formed, purely on instinct, purely from the knowledge she had been born with and had been practicing her entire life, without knowing what it was practiced for. She thought, About the look on Kalen's face in the 2 seconds before the control gathered itself, and the way he had said for me, and the way he had said trusting your instincts and mine, and the way he had held out his hand across the hall. Not as a king, but as a person asking a question they actually wanted the answer to. She thought about Orla's careful handwriting, and Fenn's honest eyes, and Aldrich's amber certainty, and the old language moving under her fingers like something that had always been waiting to be read. She thought about the thin scar on her palm that she had gotten from an iron latch on an ordinary morning when she had been a stable hand, which she had not tended to, which she had not thought about, which had turned out to be exactly the right wound in exactly the right moment. She did not think about Lady Vienne. She thought about herself, which she had not done very often, and about Kalen, and about Aldrich, and about the warmth, and about what it felt like to be finally, specifically, exactly where you were supposed to be. "What happens now?" she said. He looked at the room in front of them, the complicated political landscape, the adjusting faces, the work that was ahead of them both. "Now," he said, "we begin." He said it the way people say things when they mean them, simply and directly and without additional architecture. And she stood beside him in the center of the ceremonial circle with Aldrich warm and steady against their joined hands. And she thought, yes. And she thought finally, and she thought I was always going to end up here, in exactly this place. And she thought I was just the last to know it. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?